We're going to talk about this.
Sorry.
Perfect. We're going to talk about the idea that there's some things we can't self-care out of and really dig into that. But before we start, you should know a little bit maybe about who I am because we're going to spend a bunch of time together. Let me just tell the meeting it's okay that it's recording. Okay, so I'm Cassie Gillespie. I use she, her pronouns. I am a licensed clinical social worker, which I still can't say correctly without kind of like sounding a little silly. I'm the producer and host of a social work podcast called The Social Work Lens, and you can see the little thumbnail right there. That's what you're looking at. I teach at UVM, the Department of Social Work. And but really I'm here tonight under my auspices of like I do a lot of training, coaching, and consulting around workplace stress and workplace trauma. And the reason that I got involved with that is I was a former DCF worker and I did that work along with a variety of other kind of high stress social work roles for quite some time, and then ultimately felt really burnt out and like I needed to leave. And after that, I did other social work roles, but ultimately came back to doing workforce development. So, like the people who train the social workers who work for family services and DCF. And what you learn immediately in workforce development is that if you don't tackle workplace stress is going to tackle you. And so you have to figure out how to get creative around the stressors that people are facing in their workplaces. And I got really interested in that, started researching it and looking into best practices, and have really just like spent a lot of time in that rabbit hole over the last 10 years. So I'm here to talk to you about it. um, okay, so here's what we're going to do today or tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about stress and trauma exposure response. We'll talk a little bit about how we've historically been asked to deal with it. And then let me ask you a question. Am I drawing on your screen? Do you see a little blue line?
Yeah.
Interesting. Let's do this. Let's troubleshoot it right off the bat. Okay, it went away. Let's see. New share. Who's a pro? I'm a pro. All right, let's try this. um, then we'll talk about why a self-care approach isn't really working in of itself, what we can do instead. We'll practice interventions at every level, not just self. I'll make sure you leave with some resources, and we will also save plenty of time for questions. Sound okay? Okay. So I think Darla prompted you to do this already. So I always like to start by just learning a little bit about like who's in the virtual room. So I think you're already introducing yourselves, and I can open that up. But I would love, if you didn't already, to share a little bit about what your role is at your workplace, including like if you work by yourself, if you're a home provider, if you're in a solo environment, that's really great to know. If you're doing something other than early ed, that's really great to know. Just hearing a little bit more about kind of what your role is related to what brought you here tonight. And I'm going to read for a minute. All right. Home providers, lots of educators, CCV. Right. Dokes. And we'll have a couple of activities as we go through. So, oh, I should have said this before while we were just awkwardly hanging out. But if you don't have something that you can write on, now might be a great time to grab that before we really get started. If you prefer to take notes electronically or on your phone, that works too. But there'll be a couple of spaces where I pause and ask you to jot down some notes about stuff just for yourself. You won't have to share them. But if you like good old-fashioned pen and paper, you might want to grab it. I like this kind. Graph paper. Can you see? I don't know why. It feels like especially pleasing to me. All right. So we're going to spend a minute on stress versus trauma. And I promise we're not going to do a deep dive into like a trauma neurobiology frame, but there are words that get tossed around all the time about workplace stress and workplace impact. And even when we're talking about self-care, you hear so much about self-care. Our workplaces don't always take the time to define what it is we're self-caring from or for. So I want to spend some time kind of like defining the problem and putting some foundational language around it so that we all have similar words. Ooh, we've even got housing case managers. Yeah. Okay. I promise I'm not going to just read slides to you this whole time. That would be terrible. And you certainly can all, do that yourself. You don't need me. But there's a couple I will read. And so, like this one, workplace stress. It's the harmful physical and emotional responses that happen when there's conflict between job demands and the amount of control an employee has over meeting those demands. We all know this in our soul. Probably everybody on this call could describe what's stressful about work. And usually that is related to either being asked to do something you can't do or that you don't have the resources for, right? Or you have to get it done quick, or you have to get it done now, or someone doesn't like the way you did it. Any of those things are almost always related to control. Um, Probably this isn't news anymore either, but it's important to note that workplace stress has physiological response impacts on our bodies. So over time, it can lead to a whole host of problems. And it's no accident that I'm using the Canadian Center for Occupational Health and Safety's information because theirs is better than ours in terms of they have better recognition of this problem and better resources out about it. So even though we sort of all know intuitively and from our experience that workplace stress is harmful, um, it's still kind of a new topic in places to talk about. The other thing we should note is it of course impacts also your mental health and your mood. So there are like visible, measurable impacts that happen at work when we're really overstressed. I have not taken a deep dive into who's on this call, but I thought there might be an overrepresentation of female identifying people on this call, as there often are in helping fields. And we can't talk about workplace stress and then burnout, which is what results from it, without talking about the overlap with gender. So women are disproportionately stressed, more so than men. And the pandemic, the measurements that they've taken beginning in the pandemic and in the last couple of years have shown that that gap has more than doubled. Some of the ways we see that playing out and some of the causes are that women are less likely to be promoted than men in almost all workplaces, yet more likely to head single parent families and take on unpaid labor, both at work and at home. In addition, women are more likely to work in low paid fields and early, education of all sorts, social work too. We're all kind of hanging out, swimming in these same pools. And of course, the worsening childcare crisis is another factor causing more stress for women. In this article, they're talking about the women who are working and need to utilize childcare services, but I thought we had to include it for this group, right? Because so many of you are the providers of those services. So you know this better than anyone. And this is a quote from an article that's specific to talking about the kind of labor shortages in early ed. This woman says the challenge is that for the most part in 2023, most women bear the burden of managing their family in addition to the burden of whatever their work happens to be. And so I don't know if that resonates for people, but it's important that we name it right off the bat that workplace stress is a problem for everyone. It's an additionally salient problem for women. And we'll talk about this more later, but any other marginalized or vulnerable identities that you carry make it even more so. So if you're a BIPOC individual, if you identify as LGBTQ+, if you have various like disabilities, there's all these different layers of impact that can pile on that make stressful situations at work and in life more impactful. Now, on top of that, and I promise it won't be depressing the whole time, but we're going to be a little bit depressing for a minute here. Some of us might also be exposed to trauma at work. And I want to take a minute and just kind of define trauma, what I mean by that, because you'll hear people say, like, I was literally traumatized by that. But often they don't when they say that, it's not actual like the literal definition of trauma. So for our purposes, when I say some of us are exposed to trauma, I mean that you've experienced a threat to your safety and or survival, and that you didn't have the resources to cope with the threat. And over time, you see impacts from that. It kind of comes back up. It can be that traumatic events are happening at work. It could be that trauma has happened in your personal life and then events at work kind of trigger it. Or it could be that you work with people who experience trauma. Any one of those three places put you right at sort of the place where you might be interfacing with people's trauma. And anyone who's doing caregiving in any capacity or social services or really working with any vulnerable population are often exposed to not only their own workplace stress, but sometimes the suffering of the people they work for. Does this resonate so far? Yeah, okay. Why are we talking about this? Well, it's important. So you may have heard any of these terms. It depends what your role is and how your agency talks about stuff, or none of these terms. But sometimes you'll hear people talk about secondary trauma or vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue or burnout or moral injury. We'll talk more about that one because it's kind of new, but it's fascinating. Chronic stress, toxic stress, any of those terms. All of those terms come from different places and different researchers at different times, and they mean different things, right? And we could have a whole training, and sometimes I do, where we like get into each one of those and what does it mean and who's experiencing it and what's the difference between vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. But for our purposes today, let's not do any of that. That's not the training we need. That's not the training we're coming to. But I do want to just name that if you connect with any of these terms, or if you're listening to all of these and you're like, no, I'm just stressed. It doesn't feel traumatic to me. It's not related to people's trauma. That's okay too. I think it's less important that we're connecting the clinical term with what you experience at work or from work. But I want to make sure that if you have the opportunity to link up these words that you see, like kind of out in the news and in the media about it. Moral injury is one of them that you may not have heard about before. And I just think this is really fascinating because this one comes up more and more, and this term is being studied more and more. It's the idea that sometimes what you're experiencing or what you have to do in the course of your workday doesn't match your internal morals or values. And that over time, having to do stuff that doesn't match up with who you are and who you want to be takes a toll on who you are as a person. So like when I was doing child welfare work, there were times where a judge would decide a child needed to be removed that I personally, Cassie Gillespie, didn't think needed to be removed. But you still have to go out on that removal. And like, that's a really terrible place to be. Nobody signs up for a job to do, like I would imagine that most folks on this call signed up for the jobs you have because you wanted to be helpful. You wanted to give back and be in service. And when you are doubting if your job is actually in service, that creates like a special type of distress, a special type of burnout. So that's just one term I think is worth unpacking. And if you want to geek out about that more with me, I'll share my contact information at the end. Feel free. There's articles, there's visuals. I think it's fascinating. But okay, so regardless, this is sort of the scope, right? It could go from anywhere from just stress all the way up to the trauma exposures or moral injury. You following me so far? I prefer to talk about all these things as just trauma exposure response. It's just a catch-all term. It just means there was trauma, we were exposed, and there's been a response. Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky defines it as the transformation that takes place within us as a result of our exposure to the suffering of other living beings in the planet. It's basically like if you could go back and talk to yourself when you first started your job, your rose-colored glasses, like really excited, initial self. In what ways are you different and what's caused that difference? Not just your growth as a person, but sort of like the things you've seen over time. One of the things though, I really like to tell everybody this. I don't know if you all do this, but when I'm in social work spaces, social workers, we like to think we have the market cornered on human suffering and that our jobs are the hardest and that we see the most suffering. And the reality is, and I've learned this firsthand since doing consultant work with people in different roles, all kinds of people in all kinds of roles experience really significant stress, and it impacts them negatively. 2 nights ago, I was training with a bunch of product managers. Those are women in tech who, like, I'm still not even clear, frankly, on exactly what it is they do. Um, but there's people who have all kinds of really fascinating exposures in their work. And I think it's really, I don't know, maybe this isn't hopeful, but I think it's kind of hopeful, is that like we're not alone in feeling massive amounts of workplace stress. And maybe you're listening right now being like, lady, I'm not feeling massive amounts of workplace stress. And if that's you, that's great. Thank you. We're glad there's some of you here. If you have even just a little teeny bit, we'll work on that as we go. But if you are feeling pretty like overwhelmed by what you're experiencing in your life and in your workplace, um, there's all kinds of people who have all kinds of jobs out there who are doing this. So I think that's an opportunity where we can kind of think about it differently and how we can come together. Because the magic part is the stuff that works tends to work across disciplines. It doesn't really matter if you're like a veterinarian or a fire person. I was going to say a fireman, but I was trying to make it gender neutral. A fire person or an educator or a lawyer, or whatever it is. So, okay, couple more. Let's see. I'll give you where we are in the general flow. We're going to do maybe 2 or 3 more about trauma exposure, and then we're going to start to talk about kind of like the self-care myth. So, you may know this explicitly. You might just be like, oh, yeah, that feels true when I say it. But if it's new, I just want to share this because this is important. Trauma, and I'm from Long Island originally, so I can't say that word without sounding like I am. Trauma and oh, I did it good. Trauma and stress. The exposure to those things can be cumulative or acute, but they still have impact. So if you think about like a hairline fracture, like breaking a bone, but it's a hairline fracture, or a repeat, like a stress injury, versus some type of really big break in your leg, those are still broken bones, right? One comes from just repeated stress over time, like a stress fracture, versus one big thing that would cause a big break. We can think about this kind of similarly with trauma and stress exposure. So in my work as a social worker, cumulative stress exposure might look like always coming in and having too many emails to answer, that I would always have to leave without answering some of them. And I would know that the next day I'd be behind, and the next day I'd be behind, and the next day I'd be behind. And that virtually anytime I ran into someone, they would be sure to point out that they had emailed and I hadn't gotten back to them, right? That type of like constant slow burn. Um, I I don't know any or many of you personally, but sometimes from folks in your line of work, I hear about staff shortages as the cumulative stress exposure, right? Always trying to find coverage every single day, who's out, that kind of thing. Um, and then there can also be acute exposures. That's like when a really big thing happens. Um, so in child welfare, that's like when a kid gets hurt. And if you've been constantly holding that cumulative exposure where you're like almost up to here, and then something big happens, that's where we as workers can experience like a really big impact from what's happening at work. Most of our workplaces are pretty good at responding when something really big happens. If a kid gets hurt at a center, right? If there's a threat, if there's all kinds of things that could potentially happen. But when we can see them, we can recognize them, we probably know how to respond to them. But when those little kind of baseline daily stressors are in the mix, those are harder for us to have really good strategies around. So as we move through this talk, we'll try to tease those things apart too. Not just what are the big things in your job, but like what are those little things that take up a lot of your brain space and deplete you. Either way, big or little, when those things build up over time, we get impacted. And the really fascinating thing about humans is we tend to get impacted in the same ways. And this is true for stress and trauma. I want to be really clear about this. We talk about them like they're two totally different constructs, but even the term post-traumatic stress disorder, the words are right next to each other. And there's all kinds of professionals who have like really robust arguments about where stress ends and trauma starts or exactly how they work. So I really want to encourage you to grab the term that feels like the best for you. Um, but regardless of what it is that is maybe impacting you at work, when people are really impacted over time, we start to see these things. So people are sometimes angry or cynical. A sense that you can never do enough. Dissociative moments. That's where you just sort of leave your body, like your body's here, but your brain leaves. Some of you might be doing it now. And in small doses, it's adaptive. It's fine. You just take a little brain break, you like go somewhere else, come back. It's great. But when you find yourself missing whole parts of conversations and meetings or whatever else, that's like the bigger red flag. Hypervigilance and fear. This one is typically more common in people who experience trauma in the sense that they're like threatened, their safety is at risk through their work. Your brain starts to get really protective and it starts to look for things that might be dangerous. And then that can play out over time, like you being a little hypervigilant or a little extra fearful. Guilt. So many people who have stressful jobs, so many people in helping professions carry a lot of guilt about their work. They're guilty that they're not home with their kids, or when they're home with their kids, they're guilty they're not getting the work done. It's like we're just always guilty somewhere. We're not doing something. Inability to embrace complexity. This is where you find yourself saying, and I'm laughing because I mean, I don't know. I haven't met most of you yet, but somebody typically after a training, somebody's always like, I say that. Where you find yourself saying like, yeah, my job is killing me, but if I didn't do it, who would do it? Like, yeah, it would be great to do something different, but if I didn't do this job, like there would be nobody to do it. So you stay in a job or in a role maybe that's taking too much from you in this season of life. And then we've got grandiosity. Um, and over time, all of these impacts can lead up to chronic exhaustion, physical ailments, and addictions and numbing, that kind of stuff. Here's the other big way it plays out. Has anyone in here said this? You don't have to admit it. But in some type of supervision or in some type of getting together with your more comfortable coworkers after work, you're saying it's not the clients or it's not the families or it's not the kiddos, it's my coworkers. And there's this weird thing where when we work in helping professions, we're often able to give the most of ourselves to our like dedicated service users, whoever that may be, and then we have nothing left for the people that we work with, and we have really limited patience for the nonsense that goes on back in the organization. So couple other kind of contextual stressors for early educators. Many of you, and here, this slide's always weird because I don't want to sit here and paint the picture. You know it, you live it, right? But what I do want to share is that these things, if they ring true for you, they put you at extra risk for impact or a specific risk for impact. So like many people in helping professions, I think you're working with a severe and persistent resource shortage. And I put staff shortage in its own box. So this is just the straight up like, it's your persistent resource shortage, but also the resource shortage that is so hard to say without like fumbling, resource shortage of the families who are using the services or other clients, or if you're a manager of your staff, but that includes money and time. And then there's staff shortages, which is one of the biggest. There's a bunch of new studies coming out about how staff shortages are connected to increased stress response in whoever's ultimately responsible for the coverage. Often just because of your role and your proximity to like the relationships you have with the families you're serving, you're sitting with the suffering of the families when something's going on for them. And then this next one we don't always talk about a lot, but it's really impactful. It's connected to that moral injury idea I was talking about. Sometimes when you work so close with families, you're the object and the agent of the suffering. So you're not only there kind of witnessing what's going on for families, but you might have to give them bad news that causes some of the suffering. You might be saying, hey, I had to call in a DCF report today, or whatever the kind of comparable stressor might be. And that creates its own whole feeling that we have to deal with. And then there's our own personal and social identities. We started to talk about this a little bit with like how women experience workplace stress at a rate that's much higher than men. And at times, of course, we experience direct, not indirect trauma. I truly don't know how common this is in your work for like first responders and law enforcement and people going out doing home visits. It's not uncommon for people to actually experience like a safety threat in the course of their day. Lots of educators in bigger buildings too are worried about school shootings. There's different ways in which you may be exposed to not just witnessing someone else's suffering, but sort of being in a traumatic situation. And I think I actually already spoke a little bit about this, but what this slide is talking about is, so vicarious trauma is one of those terms again. They mean witnessing the suffering of other people is hard and takes a toll. Um, there's an intersectionality between that and systematic oppression. So um, if you carry an identity, right? If you identify as a marginalized group, so if you identify as a queer woman or a Black woman or a disabled woman or, you know, a trans woman even, and then you're working with people who experience that same thing and you're watching them like have to deal with the same stuff that you have to deal with on the one hand, that can make you an incredibly empathetic provider. On the other hand, it probably brings up your stuff and takes a different toll. Also, if you carry any of those identities that are discriminated against, and then you're out in the world just trying to do your work and you're experiencing microaggressions or just straight up oppression because of who you are or how you look, that creates a whole other stressor going to work that people who have like mainstream, you know, privileged identities don't have. So it's layered and it's complicated. Now, I know that was a lot of heavy, maybe depressing things that you maybe didn't want to sit through, but I feel like it's really important that we have that context before we kind of move into this idea of like, I guess really it's important to me to paint the picture of exactly how serious it is what we're up against before we kind of unpack the self-care idea, because it's just so wild to me that we just keep getting told, you know, hey, everyone's so stressed, you should do some self-care. So let me pause here for a minute. Do people have questions so far? And you can unmute and ask them or type them in the chat. I'll take a sip of water and give you a minute. Okay, maybe no, maybe not yet. If you're like, hey, I'm typing, don't go so fast, that's okay. We can come back to it. Go ahead, send the question. But so with all of that we've laid out, all the workplace stress, all the workplace trauma, for the most part, going back decades, when workplaces do kind of acknowledge this at all, typically they acknowledge it in these three ways. There's a focus on individual actions, self-care, self-care. They'll just, you're just told about self-care. And then maybe there's a focus on interpersonal supports. That's the academic language for the stuff that happens in between people, like Taco Tuesday, or maybe your shelter or workplace or like center has like a pet wall or, you know, like something like that, like something that's designed to create connections between people. And then sometimes there's some organizational policies and procedures, like in the professional development realm. But for the most part, you know, even today I was going through, I was looking for some quotes, and I'll tell, it comes up in a couple slides, but I was looking up like early educators and childcare centers and burnout and stress, and every single article was like, yeah, it's so bad. Are you taking care of yourself? Did you go for a walk today? Did you play yourself some nice music? And I'm always just blown away at how like this one little solution is offered for this whole big problem that we're facing. So, how about at your workplaces? What types of strategies has your workplace used to try to address stress in the workplace? Go ahead and throw it in the chat. Let me see what you got. And everyone throughout the whole rest of this training, if you hear something you like, steal it. Like, please learn, you know, let's build a community where we get to swap ideas. So if your organization or if just you personally as a home provider or anything in between have an idea and it's working, share it. But it's also fine to say nothing. There's nothing happening about this in my workplace. Meals. Yeah, I feel the same. Chocolate. I mean, chocolate can go, you know, it's not nothing. mindful minute, food, workplace fitness, training on other people's work habits, personal values. Nice. I like that one. Group activities, reminders to take water breaks, always grateful to coworkers. Yeah, the interpersonal relationships, being comfortable to ask for help. Feel free to keep adding to that list too as we go, or if you're typing right now. Okay. Longer breaks, no unpaid work. Yes. I love those. Those are in the structural realm. Okay. Office potlucks, taking breaks, relationships. Yeah, they tend to all kind of fall in a lot of the same categories. Working hard to get every staff member weekly or bi-weekly reflective supervision. Yes, that's a really great one. So what I love about a lot of these responses is they're already moving out of the just self-care circle. So that's fantastic. That's great stuff to build on. All right. I've already, I don't bury the lead. I tell you from the get-go that I think self-care isn't the answer, or at least self-care alone is not the answer to what we're facing here. But I do want to talk about why. And so I'm going to offer you two answers that are evidence-based, but are also the world according to me. So what I mean by that is that there's some studies, some information that supports these conjectures. But I've throughout my work over the years, these are the two themes that just come up over and over and over again. So I've linked them together and I share them with people. So the first is impact. The idea that our ability to self-scale and problem solve in of itself may be impacted. And so I want to share a little bit about that. Who's heard the oxygen mask metaphor? Raise your hand. Yeah. Right? Yes. You have to put it on yourself, self-care, before you help someone else. And that's true. It is true. You do have to put an oxygen mask on yourself before you help someone else. But I work with Mike Cull, Dr. Mike Cull. He's actually going to be in Vermont next week, which is amazing because he lives in Kentucky. But he has this, he does a lot of work on safety culture. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But he and his team like to extend the metaphor. And so I'm going to share what he says about it, which I think is just so great. So, they talk about this idea that you're on a plane, you're flying on a plane, that planes fly around like 30,000 feet. And so when the cabin depressurizes and the oxygen masks drop down, they don't expect anybody who's suffering the effects of oxygen depletion to be able to assess that that's happening and to know what to do and to do a series of complicated equations or go find a mask. None of that is expected because they know that in an emergency situation, when your brain is oxygen deprived, you can't figure that out. It's hardwired in the plane that the mask just drops right in front of you. And all you have to do is put it on. And even then, they still had to remind us that we have to put ours on first before we put someone else's on. But the idea is that they're not saying, well, maybe you should try to figure out exactly how oxygen deprived you are and maybe figure out what concentration of oxygen would be best, right? Because that's just too complicated. But in our general workspaces, this whole idea of you just need to self-care implies that we know when we need to take a break, and self-care implies that we have the things we need to be able to self-care, that we have the ability to take a break or that we have the ability to, do whatever the thing is that would help us get back to normal and feel better. And so often none of those things are true. And, I don't know if anyone else on this call has ever been so hungry that you were real snippy to someone and then someone in your life asked you if maybe you just needed to eat something. Does this ever happen to other people? This happens to me. And I'm like, no, it's not about that. It's about whatever. And then I eat something and then I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I was just really hungry. Our brains are really fascinating the way they work. And usually when we're real worked up about something that might not actually be related to the thing, we're often the last to know. So this magic idea that we'd be able to assess ourselves all the time, have a reasonable assessment, have a good problem plan, be able to problem solve it, and then have all the resources we have. Like, it's just crazy. It's just crazy. We're just not, the person who's impacted, who needs the help, is probably not able to do all that. The thing about Mike Hull's work and the safety culture work that I love is that they stop thinking about resilience as the property as a person. So it stops being about like, oh, Cassie's not very resilient. She burnt out at the job. It starts being about what types of oxygen masks can we hardwire into the job? Because we know that everybody who does this job experiences but. And that when they do, it would be really helpful if they had access to . Does that make sense? So you start thinking about resilience as a property of your system, not the person. Now, I just want to pause right here and name, if you're a solo provider, or you're probably like, like that's the answer, get out of here. Because we know that something is effective, having team and organizational processes doesn't mean that if you don't have those things, you're left out. We're still going to talk about a lot of things that will feel relevant. But I would offer now, and I'll offer it a couple ways throughout, that if you are working in an environment where you're the only employee, we're going to have to get creative in thinking differently about who's your team. Maybe it's the families you work with. Maybe it's the people in your family, you know? But none of us can do it alone. So, okay. So that's reason one. We can't assess because we're the people who need the help. Other example about that, it's like when you try to tell your kiddos they're tired. Like, well, I think maybe you're just tired. Tired. Okay, fine. They're totally tired. We often are the last people to know what we need. The other, but this is the big one for me, it's scope of influence. Okay, so this is a quote from Pooja Lakshman, and she wrote a great book, but if you're not into reading books, I'm not lately. I have too much going on. She was on a really good podcast, so we can share that later. She says, when we are blaming the individual for something like burnout, we are exonerating the broken social structures. And I couldn't feel more seen in this. Like, yes, there are things that I could do better. But the reality is there aren't enough resources in my family or time in my day for me to self-care to the extent that would be necessary for me to not feel stressed at work or not feel impacted by these things. This is a quote from an immigration attorney. I know I'm not presenting to the immigration attorneys, but I just love the way this lady says it. So I want to share it because I feel like it'll resonate. She says, all the self-care in the world won't change the fact that I work in a place and within a system in which asylum cases are granted only 3% of the time. The odds are always against my clients, and that is the root of the problem. It is hard to experience the relaxation promised by lavender pillow mist when your clients are trapped in detention centers without access to proper hygiene or food. It's the structural stuff. And here's the quote I found from the childcare director when I was going through all those really disappointing articles earlier. Jennifer Trippett says, I've had some staff leave recently because they can't afford childcare for their own children at my center. Most of my staff that have left to stay home with their kids or to go to work in the medical field where they can work nights and not have to pay for childcare. Trippett used to offer a steep discount for staff members enrolling childcare at children at her center, but the rising cost of keeping her business afloat meant that she had to make changes. She estimates that half her staff rely on WIC or SNAP government benefits to make ends meet. I don't know if that really resonates for you. And if, like, please tell me later. Please tell me if that was a good one or if like you feel a little bit seen in there. But the idea behind this one is like, there isn't any amount of, to that attorney's point, lavender pillow mist that's going to change the realities of how hard it is to have all the positions filled or what the economic realities are for any of us, let alone the families using the services. So this idea that we can just kind of like do enough yoga to be better, and that these things wouldn't be a problem, I find it to be not only false, but insulting. So you can't self-care your way out of structural problems. If that's the only thing you take away from this training, that's the thing. That's the thing right there. But, well, I was going to jump to the what do we do, but actually this one's important too. This quote went viral in the pandemic. This is from Nikita Valerio. She's an activist and a writer. She's amazing. But she said, shouting self-care at people who actually need community care is how we fail people. And I feel like that is doubly true for educators, doubly true for mothers, if you're also mothering, and caretaking or taking care of elderly parents, right? There's all these ways in which we're holding things together in a precarious way and also being told to take care of ourselves as though that's going to fix the structural issues that have landed us here. So here's the big question, right? Any idiot can stand up and define a problem. Like we're clear on the problem. So what do we do instead? That's what we'll spend the rest of our time kind of talking about here. Oh, I was just opening up the thing. Amen. Thank you. Okay, so visually, if you're a visual learner, we are exposed, because I went through it all at the beginning, right? I made you listen, to trauma and stress at multiple levels: individual, team, organizational, societal. If you're not working in an organization too, like we can do this in our personal lives. You can say individual, family, extended family, community, society, whatever kind of rings true for you. But we are exposed to trauma and stress at all those levels. And yet we've been told to self-care as though it's going to fix it, right? And so when you look at the graphic, it's like, of course, that's only the middle circle. Like, yes, we all have a responsibility to self-care, and we do. For all my ripping on it, like we really do, and we'll even talk about it later. But that's just the little circle. So we also need to think about strategies that can work in the team and organizational and then even societal circles. But for today, we'll mostly talk about individual, team, and organizational. And, as I was saying before, if you're a solo home provider, I don't want you to have to dissociate and or be like, when we get to team or organizational. So we can help kind of troubleshoot what the team is and what the organization is. This happens when I talk to, like, I do a lot of work with attorneys, and there's a lot of lawyers who work in independent practice, or social workers or therapists who are in private practice. Like, you're not alone in this kind of sticky wicket of, I've chosen a role that is very flexible, and as a result, now I work in isolation. And so there's lots of people who also experience that, and we can talk about that too. Okay, so in the beginning, when I was showing you the stuff about trauma exposure response and all those different signs, that's the work of Laura van Lipsky. And I love this woman, and I got her to come on our podcast. And so if you want to hear me do a really terrible interview of this amazing woman, we can do that. I can offer you that. That already happened. Um, but she talks about trauma stewardship. There's a really wonderful book that this quote is from, as sort of like the antidote of being stressed at work. The idea is stewarding the trauma or stewarding the stress and the suffering. It's a daily practice through which individuals, organizations, because it's not just on the individual, and societies tend to the hardship, pain, or trauma experienced by humans and other living beings on the planet. And that sounds nice, but you might be like, well, what does that actually mean? Okay, here's what I do in my private consulting with different workplaces. And so what I'm sharing with you is kind of an amalgamation of best practices that over time we've built that really move the needle. So building a healthy workplace culture. It's in quotes because probably every single one of us on this call would define it differently. However, you can assess, define, and measure what workplace culture is and what you want it to be, and then you can move it. So it is a really broad term that can mean a lot of things, but it's totally possible to drill down to what you want your workplace culture to be, and then to work closer to getting it. That makes sense. We do need self-care strategies, and we do need them for home and work. It's just, it can't be the only thing we're talking about. Psychological safety for staff. We'll talk more about that. Mindfully organized roles and teams. This might be where you're like, what is she on about? How did we get here? I'm going to thread this needle for you. It's going to make sense. I really just come along with me. And then for any of this stuff to happen, this is the organizational stuff. You need organizational prioritizing and resourcing of these things. Spoiler, your organization brought me here. So that's they were already like, they were looking around for someone to kind of talk about this. So I think there's goodwill there. So that's good. That's great. Okay, for the rest of our time, we're going to talk about what we actually do at all these different levels. I'm still not crazy about the skydiving people here, but I selected it because I was able to find images where there was an individual, kind of a team, and then a bigger group. That's the organization. Also, I feel like I'm jumping out of a plane half the time. I don't know. Do you? Like, it felt like it wasn't totally off. I had ones with like flowers. I was like, let's be skydivers. Let's do that. So we're going to start with organizational first, because it's sort of like it's the biggest chunk of work, but for our purposes here, we're not necessarily all in the same workplace, right? Some of us, as we've already established, are kind of home providers. So we're just going to touch on some organizational strategies, and then we'll spend a bunch of time with team and individual strategies. Let me breathe for a second. We're almost halfway through. It's like, 5 to 7. There'll be a couple of places in the next hour where I have you do activities. That's why you got that pen and paper. And those are good places to also wiggle and get water, if you need, but we don't have a total break scheduled. So if at this point you just need a wiggle or you need to turn off your camera and dance, whatever you need to do. Any questions before we jump in here? Kim's here. Okay. So the first organizational strategy I want to talk to you about is safety culture, and it's the oxygen mask guy. That's why that's the same visual. Mike Hull. So Mike Hull talks about safety culture as the idea is the extent to which an organization and its members value the attitudes and behaviors, focus their attention and effort on safety, and pursuing reliable, harm-free operations. That's a mouthful, and I would offer one of those mouthfuls that doesn't seem to say a lot, but you have to offer the real definition when you talk about the thing. So, put simply, safety culture comes from safety science. It's this idea that there are certain jobs that mistakes have really high stakes. So like nuclear power plants, aviation, surgery, right? Taking care of small children, child welfare. There's a bunch of them. But when things go wrong and people make mistakes, people get really hurt. And so in those cultures or in those workplaces, they need to work extra hard to make sure that there's layers and layers of safety. And perhaps surprisingly, we'll talk more about this when we get to psychological safety, but it turns out that the best way actually to make sure no real big mistakes happen is to build a culture where everyone gets to talk about small mistakes as soon as they happen, so that you build a norm of letting people know when you've messed up, and that you build the relational trust at your workplace in the first place, so that I can be like, Darla, I know I said I was going to be available for the training, but it turns out, whatever the thing is. So that's kind of like safety culture in a nutshell. And then as part of that, there's these specific practices. It's important to note here that safety culture is not built because we want all the workers to be happy. We do, but it's built this way to have the most safe outcomes for whatever the place is. But it turns out that the structures, the workplaces that are the safest in outcomes are the best to the workers. And that is no accident, right? But sometimes interesting. So when you have high levels of safety culture, it looks like this. You've got physical and psychological safety for staff. Oh, I should have defined psychological safety. If you haven't heard that term before, we're not talking about everybody feeling safe. We're not worried about snowflakes or like people, having brave spaces or whatever. It's the idea that when I mess up, I know that I can tell somebody and that I'm still respected as a human, that we can use mistakes as opportunity for learning as opposed to opportunities for punishment. And we'll talk way more about that a little bit later. But when you have that, then you start to really have trust with your coworkers and colleagues, and you're able to build all kinds of really cool practices that you wouldn't necessarily think. So the study that kicks all this off, this is Amy Edmondson. And so they were doing a study on the rates of error reporting on nursing units in hospitals. And they thought that the floors that had the least amount of reported errors would have the best outcomes for patients, right? Because it makes sense. Like they're not having any mess ups there. They would have the best outcomes. What her team found when they went in was exactly the inverse. The floors that had the highest levels of reported errors had the best outcomes for patients. And the floors that had the lowest levels of reported mistakes had by far the worst outcomes for patients. And it turned out, and when you think about it for a sec, you're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense, is that the mistakes were happening. They're happening all over the place. But on the floors where people felt safe enough to confess to those things and ask for help, they were able to surface up problems and solve for them and then not repeat them. But on the wards where you had to hide a mistake because you were worried you'd get yelled at or worse, fired, nobody confessed to them and then people got hurt. So I know we're not all like surgeons or working at power plants, but there's a version of that that's still really relevant in our workplace. So when we talk about psychological safety later, I'll ask you to think about like how it maybe shows up in your office, you know? I had to do it just the other day at my work. I hadn't I teach at the university level and there was like a pilot for a new evaluation, end of course evaluation. And I was nervous. You know, it ended up being fine and I had done it correctly, but for a minute there I was nervous and I had a moment where I was like, am I going to admit that I didn't do this? And I was like, yes, Cassie, yes, you're going to admit that you didn't do it. But I felt the pull to be like, no, I don't know what happened. It was the technology, you know? Okay. Inclusivity and belonging is really important in workplaces. If people are going to feel safe to just show up, if you have to hide parts of who you are because you're worried about acceptance at work, you're not going to be able to get your best work done there because for obvious reasons you're attending to protecting yourself, you know? So that's just like a baseline. Worker connectedness. So here's a weirdness. Turns out that the closer you feel to your colleagues, the better you perform at work. And the more likely you are to say hard things, to take interpersonal risks, and to let someone know when they're messing up. And so it makes sense. It doesn't mean that you have to be besties. It's not just the person you're going to get drinks with after work. You certainly don't have to be friends with everybody. Introverts, don't you worry. We're not saying you got to hang out with everybody. But if you feel an authentic, and I do not know how the rest of the world says that word. Every time I say it, I hear my mother, but an authentic connection with your colleagues, um, you're set up to just perform better in the workplace. So that's something, again, these things feel like, how do you feel connected to everyone? Oh, don't you worry, we have strategies. Stress recognition, this goes back to that idea of like, are you just hungry? Are you just tired? What strategies, what oxygen masks have you built into your workplace for people to know when they're stressed and for us to like check in with each other, have accountability? Again, don't you worry, we have strategies. And then mindful organizing. Remember that slide forever ago where it was like, it's not the clients or it's not the families, it's my coworkers, right? There's all this like background noise of the things that make you crazy at work. So much of it is related to having inefficient collaboration with your colleagues, lack of clarity about roles or responsibilities, right? Or lack of resources. The lack of resources thing is hard, gonna lie, I don't have great strategies around that. That's, I guess, legislative advocacy. But those first two, we can really move. Like if you really get clear on who does what and how you do it, and you can get the background noise out of there about all the inefficient collaboration and like inefficient communication, you just have a lot more space and time. You have a lot less emotional stress, and people experience really significant decreases in job stress. There was a study out of New Jersey a couple years ago where like all of a sudden the turnover rate for New Jersey child welfare workers was like 20%, which is crazy because the turnover rate for child welfare workers is like real high. It's like usually above 40%. And so everyone was like, Jersey, what'd you do? And, you know, they had a couple different strategies. They did a safety culture implementation, but one of the biggest things they did is they just clarified everybody's roles and then had effective communication strategies. And people were like, wow, the job's still hard, but like, I'm just clear on what's mine, you know? So you'd be shocked at how far that can get you. Okay, we're going to pivot to some individual stuff. we could really talk about organizations for a lot longer, but like I said, that part's going to be quick. But if you are out there and kind of wondering, actually, wait, let me go back just this one time. This safety culture, like I was talking about with Mike Hull, the oxygen mask guy, we've had him do 2 podcasts with us as well. So if you want to know more about the organizational stuff, listen to Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, listen to the Mike Hull Safety Culture podcasts. And Darla and Courtney and Lori, I can, if we haven't already shared those links with you, I can, so that people can grab them easily. Okay, individual. Now this goes back to that self-care stuff. So, you know, this is true, but I'm using the term individual strategies. There's some kind of old reliable here. There's having a therapist, which is amazing. And if you don't, you know, we all recommend. There's using the time off. I know I don't know. I would imagine there's at least somebody here who just in their head was like, yeah, I would love to take the time off. Who's covering my work while I take the time off, right? I'm sorry. I see you. I've been in that role. That is really hard. But if there are any folks out there who have the time off and they can take the time off and they just haven't done it, please schedule the time off. It is so rejuvenating. And if there's any supervisors or managers out there, maybe check in with your folks, because maybe there's someone who could take the time off who thinks they're in the, I would love to take the time off, but who's going to do this camp, right? Maybe you have an idea. Maybe you can have that be different for them. Then moving beyond those tired tropes that we hear about a lot, we're going to talk now about restorative coping strategies and self-scaling. So this will hopefully be like a little bit different than the normal self-care discussion. Ooh, ooh. Okay. I've got it under control. It's coming. There we go. Okay, engaged versus disengaged coping. Have you heard about this? Has anyone heard about this? This is psychological sciences. And I don't know if anyone has a psych degree. I'm sorry. I don't know why I use that voice. It feels official. Okay, so engaged coping. This is the definition over here. It's very kind of clinical, but here's what we mean. The things you do for yourself that are proactive and maybe even preventative. So therapy, exercise, meditation, writing music, playing music, reading. I have a giant jigsaw puzzle table in there. Sometimes I train in that room when my kids aren't all over the house. And then I like turn the screen and show you all the puzzle pieces. Whatever it is, you know, knitting, like there's all kinds of things that just help you integrate. They help relieve stress. They help your brain move through things. Those are engaged coping strategies. Disengaged coping strategies. Number 1, disengaged coping strategy. Here, I'll model it. I guess you don't make that face when you're on the phone. That's the mascara face, isn't it? But you know, just scrolling, mindless scrolling, binging Netflix, binging shows, using substances to numb out, you know. And here's the thing, disengaged coping, not all bad. We all need some of it. It gets a bad rap, but it has a place and a time. I used to work in a residential treatment facility. I don't know if anyone currently does or used to. I used to have one really long day. It was a 14-hour shift. And when I would come home, I would literally cocoon on the couch in a blanket. And then I would watch just on cable, because it was a million years ago, reruns of America's Next Top Model, because it was a million years ago. But that's what I would do to decompress. And I needed that. I absolutely needed that for a couple hours before I could kind of rejoin and then move into my engaged coping strategies. But point is, there's a good amount of research out there that unsurprisingly says engaged coping strategies give you a little bit more bang for your buck. They help sort of put pennies in the bank as opposed to like taking pennies out. But really, most importantly, what we want to pay attention to is when you notice that you can't do your engaged coping skills anymore because you can only do your disengaged coping skills. So like if you used to go for a walk all the time or go to the gym all the time after work or play on a, I don't know, a kickball league or a softball league or whatever it is, or go to paint and sip or whatever it is that you do. And now you can't because it's just so hard and you need to just zen out after work. That's a place to notice, right? When you're like just flipping over or only able to use one kind, that's a red flag. The other thing is there's a whole group of folks out there who need to constantly keep going because if they stop, they feel anxious. And so when you've completely let go of your disengaged strategies because you have to be on the go, on the go, on the go, on the go, that's a red flag too. So activity time, grab your graph paper or whatever it is that you've got going. We're going to take, let's do 3 minutes and then I'll have you start writing in the chat. 3 questions. Yeah, you know what? We'll do 5 minutes on this. We'll make it deeper. I want to know what coping strategy, or I don't need to know. Please list for yourself what coping strategies you typically use. So just start writing them down. And then after you've done that, go back and start to just get curious about which are engaged and which are disengaged. And then if you've done all those, the bonus question is, how do you know when you need them? But we might not get there. It's okay to start with just what they are. I would bet that almost everyone on this call is going to have at least one where they're like engaged, disengaged. I don't know. Reading books. I don't know. Like which one is it? You can often answer that question just by thinking about when you use it. Is it the thing you do when you're just completely done and you've quit for the day and you can't anything else? Or is it something you do to actually like, this feels good. This feels healthy. So take a little time with that. If you have any questions, unmute or put it in the chat. Can you all hear my family in the background? Are they disrupting you? No. Okay. They're disrupting me. Okay. Lori's kicked us off here. Playing solitaire. 30-minute drive home. Yeah, the drive home. Love it. Stephanie's got some disengaged strategies. More is into cleaning. Yeah, cleaning's a good one. People really like that. And Stephanie, I think all of those strategies you've listed are everybody's doing those too. They're great. Reading, watching TV, walking. Oh, a note about walking. Other things that fall into this category: biking, running, skiing, uphill, cross country skiing, to anything where you have like right, left, right, left, right, left. That's called bilateral stimulation. For whatever reason, typically some, like most researchers will go back to like all the way in the womb, like some biological hardwiring of sense of safety. those bilateral stimulation activities are really regulating. People just feel a lot calmer after they do them. And if you do them regularly, it can be like a preventative and proactive thing. It can also be if you're someone who, let's say, runs regularly and then you get an injury and you can't run, it's incredibly dysregulating. It's like you can't get your fix, you know? They're that good. Music. Did I see Grey's Anatomy? Yes. Only the early seasons, though, for me. Walking. Bravo. I didn't expect, you never know how training is going to go, like what weird nonsense you're going to talk about. Today, I feel like it's been more TV-ish than normal. Hiking, drive home, listening to books. Okay. All right. It sounds like you've done a great job identifying. I want to pivot and start sharing, if you're willing, everything's challenge by choice, how you know when you need a coping skill. Like, how do you know? What's happening? Gardening's a great one. Information processing is poor, can't absorb a ton, lash out, feel overwhelmed. When it's all you think about, when your shoulders are up, that's great. That's a somatic one. Like, how does it feel? Your shoulders are up here. Yes. Can't focus. Working remotely, need a transition. Body hurts, anxious, can't sleep. Yep. You could all teach the course. Headache, brain is racing. These are all the things. Yes. Overwhelmed, not really hearing or listening. Brain hurts, easily overwhelmed, overstimulated. I get really weird about loud noises. I'm like constantly like running over and grabbing the remote from my children to turn on the TV. And then it's not even that loud. Wanting to check out, irritable, fatigued. Yes. Okay. Now, the purpose, wanting to hide, starting things, finishing none, tight body, feeling tense, anxious, restless, crazy, nervous system on overdrive. Yep. Feeling like you can't stop. I love that one. It's so relevant. Okay. The reason I wanted you to think about those things is, I don't know, maybe you've been asked this question a million times at other trainings, but I had gotten pretty far along in my career before anyone ever asked me how I knew when I needed a coping mechanism. So that's helpful. And now that you've said it out loud, I'm hoping that you can kind of hold that right here, because we're going to now talk about stress scaling. We instinctively try to manage our stress when we know we have it, but it is really hard sometimes to know. I will tell you, I was on the phone with my mom the other day, and she was telling me something about whatever else, and she was like, and then she's got a great Long Island accent. She was like, and then it turned out I was totally stressed. And she was like, and I mean, how was I supposed to know? And I went, wait, what? Because I was only half listening. I was driving, I was just like calling my mom to check in. And she goes, I mean, how was I supposed to know that I was stressed? Who knows when they're stressed? And so then I started laughing, and she was like, what? You know when you're stressed? I'm like, yeah, mom, there's lots of people out there who know when they're stressed. And she goes, well, I'm not one of them. And I was thinking to myself, you know what, mom, you're not alone. You're in really good company. So this is a responder stress continuum. Is it big enough? Can you read the words? No? Okay, hold on. Let's do this. I'm going to stop sharing. I reformatted, and I think it's just a little too small. Not to worry. I have 1,000 copies of it, because of course I do. All right. Coming at you in a bigger version. Yes? Better? Great. Okay. So responders, as in first responders, which perhaps some of you are also first responders, but I'm aware that that is not like the main, like Building Bright Futures is not an organization of first responders necessarily. So this is adapted from the military's combat zone. And what it is basically is a color-coded chart that first responders use to check in what they call a peer supervision model with each other. And so, first responders are like the search and rescue people, the people who are like coming out to get you when you've been like lost in the woods or your car went over ravine or something and like you need to be rescued. And so sometimes when the first responder people get there, it's too late and something really bad has happened to the person they're rescuing. Sometimes when they get there, or in the course of that, a colleague of theirs gets hurt, sometimes or dies. Sometimes they get hurt or die. So the people who are doing that work, they see a lot of suffering. And over time, they're really impacted by their work. And they have to make really complicated decisions. So it's really important for them to be like have a good awareness about where they are, because if they are really impacted and stressed out, they might not be able to make the safest decisions and they could potentially put other people at risk. You with me so far? Okay. Interesting, of great interest to me is that so this is put out by a place called Responder Alliance, and the website is in the references slide, and we can send this out too. You can literally Google this, it's public domain. But one of the things that they did is they did a podcast when they put this out. I am a little bit obsessed with the podcast. Not on, they won't be on our podcast. I think they think I'm like overzealous, perhaps. But they um we're talking about like what the biggest stressor is for the people who are doing the job, and interestingly they named that one of the biggest stressors is actually having to talk to families when something bad happens, when they're trying to rescue someone. So it's not even what they see or what they witness, it's having to talk to the family about something bad happening. And as someone who's spent as a social worker and a former child welfare worker hundreds and hundreds of hours sitting in people's houses talking to families about really hard stuff, I was like, yes, that is the most stressful thing right there. That's it. Having to sit and hold space for those conversations, right? I don't know if that's resonating for anybody else, but anyway, uh, that's actually besides the point. The point is that they developed a color coded scale to make it really simple so that they have a shared language and a shared document. So when someone's ready, they're in the green. And then at times, as you're getting more stressed, you move up the continuum until you might be in the red. One of the ways we used to talk about being in the red at social work, because we didn't have this, is burnout, right? It's like pretty much synonymous with burnout. But the thing that is so cool about this is the way this frame works, this research, this group of people talk about it, is in the red is like breaking a leg. They fully expect that you will recover. Maybe your group will make you a meal train depending on the break. Maybe you'll always walk a little different, you know, if it was a really acute injury, or maybe it'll heal completely, it'll be fine and no one will ever know that happened to you. But it's so different from like for years and years in social work, we would talk about people who were burnt out as though they like could never come back from that. Like it was like a horrible thing to be burnt out. So no wonder people didn't raise their hand and say, I'm really struggling at work. They just worked until they couldn't take it anymore and then they left. We didn't really have a model for people sort of like coming back. This is a model for scaling where you're at, but it only works if we really, truly, authentically believe that you can go to the red and then come back. Because otherwise, no one's going to raise their hand and be like, I'm in the red. Does that make sense? Okay. Also, on here, when you're looking at this, you don't have to have everything in the column. You're just picking the thing that resonates the most with you. Lots of people will look at the red and say like, I'm struggling with these things, but I do not have thoughts of suicide or suicidal ideation. And so they'll be nervous then to endorse kind of being in the red. And I always say that doesn't matter. You don't have to have everything. But if you're looking at the red and that feels like a better mark of where you are, of where your stress is than the orange, identify with the red. What I'm going to have you do first is an activity here where I ask you to look and scale yourself. Okay, on this. And you don't have to tell anybody where you're at. It's for you. But I am going to talk when we get to teams about how we do this collectively at work. Does that make sense? But for now, please take a minute or two and just look this over and figure out where you are. If you are noticing that you're in the orange or the red, I would like to know, or I'd like you to think about, does anyone know that that's where you are? Like, have you told anyone? And if you leave this training finding yourself in the orange or red and no one around you knows that, please share with someone. can be me, you can email me, or I'm certain there are probably people in your circle that you know better. But share with someone that you're struggling, because it's important that we all get support. But part of what we'll do kind of like for the rest of our time is figure out like how we do talk about this at work and who we can get support from, you know? Lots of times, when we start thinking about this, about using this at work, people are nervous to ask other people how they're doing. This is more like for supervisors, but supervisors will say things like, I can't ask them how they're doing, or childcare directors, right? I can't ask my teachers how they're doing. They're all in the red. And then everybody's in the red. And then what are we going to do? We're all in the red, right? Well, here's the thing. People are in the red if they're in the red, whether you ask them or not. At least if you're talking about it, there's a possibility of surfacing up a problem. Remember that psychological safety thing? Like, we're not pretending it's not happening. We can at least talk about it. We may not be able to fix the overall structural issues that have built this problem, but we may be able to find some low-hanging fruit, or at a minimum, some connection with each other. Because human relationships, that's the best tool we have in our arsenal to be well in our lives and in our work. And that's why the self-care thing is such nonsense, because it literally takes out the relational part of relationships. But we've already hit the self-care thing. Okay. Has everyone been able to take a minute and look at this? Okay. Last question about this for now, activity that I'm going to ask you to do is look at the green. Think about what that feels like, right? What is one thing that is so soothing to you that it gets you closer to green after you do it? I want you to all leave kind of having articulated that. And if you want to share that in the chat, feel free. That's a challenge by choice. What if you're in between colors? No worry. Lots of people are. I think sometimes people also just feel more comfortable saying that too. Like that might be the accurate, and that might be the accurate read, but I think there's also something that's just comfortable about saying, I'm a little bit here and a little bit there, rather than like putting yourself in a box. It's just a stress scale. We just want to have some baseline. So you can be wherever you are. That's great. But if you're finding yourself in orange or red, I do want you to let someone know if you haven't already. Because as we talked about before with the oxygen masks, it's really hard to come up with a creative solution when you're really struggling. So somebody around you might be able to help. Somebody just said, I don't think I've been in the green in my entire adult life. That is like the truest thing. That's my dog. I'm sorry. I thought it was a child crawling in here. I was like, what is going on over there? Yeah. So sometimes when I work with someone and they say they're in the red, I'll ask a couple of questions. Sometimes I ask, do you know what you need? Because lots of time people do, but sometimes people don't because of everything we just talked about with the oxygen mask. But I don't want to assume that someone doesn't know. So sometimes people will be like, yes, I need the day off, or like, yes, I need this case to get off my plate, or yes, I need someone else to hold this project, right? That kind of stuff. Sometimes a question I ask is, when was the last time you were in the green? And you'd be surprised how many times people are like, I don't, not like since before I had kids, since before, But just really the point of this activity is, what is one thing you can do that gets you closer to green? Sense of mission. And it doesn't have to be at work. It can be something you do in your private life or your personal life. Feeling effective, spiritually connected. Yep. Avalon's asking, what if we know what we need, explained it, we can't get it? Yes, I'm going to write that down. We're going to come back to that one. That's a really good question. Gratitude, breakthroughs, be in nature, be emotionally available, gratitude. Great. Okay. What I want to link up for you here. Remember what we did before when I asked what you normally do for coping? And now I've asked what gets you back to the green. Sometimes it's the same thing. Sometimes it's not. I want to just notice. I want you to notice if what you're doing for coping doesn't get you anywhere near the green, right? Because that's something to notice, because you might be able to switch that up a little. And then when I asked you, how do you know when you need it? You know, like your shoulders are up here, you're talking short, whatever those examples were. If I know this is an if, because some of us are in a season of life where we don't have a second or a minute that's not accounted for. But if you're in a season of life where you're able to notice that you're stressed and you have a second to do something about it, this would be a great place when you notice how you're feeling to do something that gets you closer to green, if you can. But this is why the self-care paradigm isn't enough, because plenty of us don't have the time or the things to do when we do feel that way. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing this and go back to our PowerPoint. While I'm doing that, does anybody, I know we have the question about what if you know what you need, but you can't get it. Do other people have questions right now? Kind of a quiet bunch. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about team. Now, well, actually, let me do it this way. These are the things we're going to talk about. Scaling as a team, like we just started to talk about scaling, mindful organizing, the team is secure base model. Jean will be presenting that, and the attention to psychological safety. But first, before we start talking about this, pick a team. Bring a team to mind before we talk about any of the stuff that you work with. It will help. It'll help focus what we're talking about. And if you are working in a place where there is no natural team that comes to mind, you can use a team in your personal life. You can use whoever the people are that you call when you've had the bad day, you know, but take a minute and kind of pull them to mind. Okay. I told you, I kind of teased a little bit about this mindful organizing thing. This is where we get really clear on who does what and how and when. And then we said, but how do we actually do that? Here's two of the strategies that we can use to do that. Planning ahead and reflecting back. It's not like neuroscience. I was gonna say it's not neuroscience. It actually is neuroscience. Like it does stuff in your brain, but whatever. It's not like the most complicated algorithm. But regularly building in places where at work, you and the people you work with can both plan ahead and reflect back will make huge differences in your work. It may not sound that new, shiny, or exciting. I will tell you, it's a little bit hard to lift off sometimes. Because like planning ahead can look like the person in charge just giving a list of the things we're going to do this quarter, this school year. And that's like, kill me now. It's so boring. Or reflecting back can look like pulling apart people's work. And like, we've all been to that meeting, right? No one wants to go to that meeting again. So there are like nuances about how you do this, but generally speaking, if you and your team can plan ahead and talk about what could potentially go wrong, right? So if Courtney and Lori and Darla and I talked about like what could potentially go wrong in this training. And I was like, well, potentially no one would ask any questions. So I'll just keep talking, right? And I'll tell some jokes and hopefully that'll be okay. And we'd go, okay, good enough, right? That's the plan. And then after the training, we'll sit and have a conversation. We didn't actually plan to do this, but we could, where we said, well, I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that people weren't asking questions because it's late in the day or late in the school year, or I just didn't leave long enough pauses? Either way, we'd be able to kind of unpack like what could have gone differently about that, right? Questioning assumptions and perceived wisdoms. We got to make space for people to offer new ideas and for us to hear them. That's really important. Discussing ways to learn from errors and near misses. That's the mistakes things. We'll talk more. And then drawing on and deferring to each other's expertise when needed. Lots of places do this thing where the work gets divided up so that everybody has the same workload, regardless of who's good at what. That's a weird thing. Like that might be one switch at your workplace where like maybe one teacher's really great at this and another teacher's really great at that. But like, why should they both have to do equal parts of the same thing when you could have each person just do the parts that they're good at and inspired by? I don't know. But in order to do that, you have to be able to have a conversation about people's strengths, and it has to be a relatively authentic conversation. So there's some challenges there. We started to talk about the psych safety thing before, this idea that when you really believe that you won't be punished for making a mistake or asking a dumb question, then you start to open up the door to be able to have a totally different work experience to surface up mistakes. In order to do this, we have to unpack our own relationships with mistakes. So let's start like this. Let's do this one in the chat so that we like wake up a little bit. Don't answer that first question. I don't like it right now. I don't know why I put it on there, but let's start with the second question. How do you personally feel when you make a mistake? Throw it in the chat. Small, embarrassed. I'm going to read them out. Shameful, incompetent, silly. Yes, these are the feelings. Horrible. Amazing. I mean, it's not amazing, but like terrible, anxious. I feel quickly to check myself and learn from it. Disappointment, stupid, awful, judged. My worst critic. Depends on the level of mistake. Fair, fair. But like in general, the general vibe, Courtney. Okay. How do you feel when someone else makes a mistake? Again, this is going to be contextually dependent. Like if it's the same person making the same mistake all the time, you're going to have a different feel. But in general, when other people mess up and they start with like, I really messed up, how do you respond to them? Heart goes out, forgiving, you want to help, empathetic. Somebody said angry. I appreciate that. The opposite. It's okay. We all make mistakes. Empathy. How can I help? Understanding. Empathetic. It really depends. Yes, it really does depend. But mistakes happen, human. Okay. I bet you can guess where we're going with this. Pretty much in every group I've ever talked to, there's some version of when other people make a mistake, I can sit in the place of mistakes happen and we all learn from mistakes and that's fine. And then when I make a mistake, I feel really embarrassed and shameful and frustrated at myself. And it certainly depends on the level of the mistake or if somebody else keeps making the mistake over and over, but when we have this orientation to like being okay with other people making a mistake, but really judging ourselves when we make a mistake, what do you think happens? How likely are we to admit our own mistakes? There's a high psychological drive to hide mistakes, and it's biological. It's nothing about you. It's the way our brains work. We are hardwired to want to support other people when they mess up and to hide it when we mess up. And that's really important to remember as a starting point. Because then if you know that that's the place you're starting, as a team, as an organization, you can do a lot of things to work around that. There's some teams I work with. Does anybody on this call have like a morning check-in that you do? Or like a meeting check-in? Like a how's everyone doing kind of go around? I see some heads yes, and some people are like, no. Okay. Well, if you have it, yep, some people have it. There's a team, there's I guess 2 teams I work with who to start to work on this at one point had the morning check-in be, or not the morning, the meeting check-in be, what did you mess up this week? And the nice part about that is like it's a real low level lift. You could go as deep as you wanted, but you could be like, oh, I left the house and my lunch was on the counter. Like you don't have to like reveal your whole soul. But it just started to normalize that everyone was making mistakes. And then the follow-up question was, what did you learn from it? And so if it was a work-related mistake, everyone was able to kind of like shift their experience about what that meant. And while it might not seem like a straight line from I talk about my mistakes to I'm less stressed at work, there's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that it is. Because when we feel connected, when we feel seen, when we feel like we can be vulnerable, when we give ourselves permission to not know how to do everything and we start to figure out how to collaborate differently, we experience much lower levels of workplace stress and workplace suffering. And we're able to make better use of the relationships that are there. And then I'm going to throw these kind of sciencey words out where they talk about how this helps us mitigate and metabolize the workplace stress and trauma that we're exposed to because we feel connected. Bessel van der Kolk is the kind of like godfather of trauma. And he talks about this idea that there isn't almost anything that we can't overcome with enough time and enough support. We can't really make more time. I mean, that's a finite resource. But we can probably get rid of some of the noise that gets in the way of us utilizing the support we have. So that's that first part. Next part is this same old continuum. It's the same thing. So I'm not going to pull up the other slide because you've already seen it. But it's the idea of doing it as a group. where if you supervise people, if you're a manager, that you ask the folks on your team how they're doing. You can have this kind of like posted in your office or something like that. Or you can, as a team, do it as like a check-in, or you just have it posted around and you start to use it as shorthand. Like, hey, you look really stressed. Are you headed to the red? Something like that. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's do this reflection. If you have a standing check-in on your team, either remotely, via text, or in a meeting, what is it? Like, how do you do it? What would it take to go deeper? And let's start there. Let's hear some responsive. And if anyone wants to unmute and share about it, I can put down the slideshow for a minute. We could hear some other voices. I'm going to do it. I'm going to stop the slides. So who's got a standing check-in that they're willing to share about? Tessa, lay it on us.
Yeah. So this training is just like really awesome. I think we're not asking questions because you're being really clear. At least that's what's happening for me, just to validate that for you.
Thank you.
But this is just such a big thing for me because I was the burnt out teacher for so long. And now being in the director role is just so important to me to kind of protect my team from burnout to the best of my ability. So like right now our check-in, like I go into everybody's classroom every morning and just engage with them. Also not immune to the staffing shortage thing. So I'm often working alongside them. But yeah, I would be curious to figure out how to have a measurable piece for them. And so I actually had a teacher today where she was like, I'm not going to make it. And I was like, to what? And she was like, to our vacation in January or in July. And I was like, why do you have to? And she was like, I can't use my time off. And I was like, why? And so I was like, how about you take next Thursday, Friday, and then have Saturday, Sunday, Monday off? And she was like, oh my God, I can do that. I was like, yeah. But it is having like these little moments with them. Yeah. But I do wonder how to have a more that I think having that green, orange, yellow, red, like having something like that would be really helpful. And like they could literally just like I could get a text of like hit the red, I'm gonna need you, like just and to normalize that language. I think we've done a pretty good job of creating like a psychological safe piece. I made like a huge tuition error and just found it today, like a really, really big one.
I'm sorry.
The first thing, yeah. Yep. But like the first thing I did is like went to my team because I feel safe with them and was like, I just made a really huge error. And now I have to tell the board I just made a really huge error. And it was, sorry, my 3-year-old's down here.
Okay, they need a helmet. Well, while you're saying that, Tessa, let me just echo that one of the best ways you can start to grow that psychological safety piece is for anyone who's a leader to share their own mistakes, to just like normalize right off the bat. Like, hey, it's okay. We don't all know here.
Well, and I needed to like say it to them because I do feel so safe. And not that I don't feel safe with the board, but I spend hours with these people every day. But I do think having that like coded scale for them to really identify like, and to have the dialogue of, okay, like also I have a really, 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 really young team. Like I am the oldest at 30. So like, I don't know that they know what they need or how to identify, like how to bring themselves back down. So I think just having the ability to see it and measure it a little bit would be really useful for us.
And everything we've done in here today, like we can make the slides available and you can go through those questions with them. I don't know exactly when you have the time for that, but like
staff meeting tomorrow.
So there you go. So like those same types of questions. I'll offer another version of this in case the color coding doesn't feel like it, if it just didn't resonate with you all. Are you familiar with scaling questions, folks on the call? Okay, yep. So you can sub in scaling questions. So they work like this. If I said, and Tessa, you don't have to answer, right? I'm just going to use you as the example because we were just talking. If I said, Tessa, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your stress looking today? With 10 being, it's so bad, I am leaving right now and I quit. And 1 being like, I could do this forever. And people, give an answer, right? So I don't know, Tessa might say 5, who knows? There's a part 2 of the scaling question piece. This is where if you do scaling questions, like lean in, come with me. This is like 2.0 version. Then if the number you're trying to target is lower, you go down. If the number you're trying to target is higher, you go up. But I would say, okay, you're at a 5. I get it. That feels right. What would it take to get you from a 5 to a 4? And now Tessa's given me a plan, whatever comes back with. Maybe I can do it, maybe I can't. Maybe Tessa's response is, I don't know, which is fine, because then we're just going to ask different questions to get there. That's cool. Sometimes I don't know either. It's that whole oxygen mask thing, right? But sometimes I just need someone to cover this room for 5 minutes while I take a break, Okay, maybe we can do that. So thank you for sharing. I want to get back to Avalon's question. And I see in the chat that you're raising that there are no check-ins, and that's part of the problem. There is always some ceiling that we hit at which we can't go any higher, right? So it might be that our direct supervisor is not giving us what we need, or it might be that the governor is not giving us what we need, but somewhere we're going to hit it where we're not getting what we need, right? And what I would offer is that the best option is to take stock of what you do have control over right here in your scope of influence, and being thoughtful about that, and then giving some thinking to what you're trying to push in the next level up. Knowing that you might not be able to make any change there, but you might. Probably everyone on this call has been in a role where well, I shouldn't say probably everyone. I'll speak for myself. I have been in roles where I was trying to do something and my supervisor just squashed that and that was not resourced, right? I was still able to make some change sort of from here down, because that's where I was. I've also been in roles where I've had supervisory or leadership support and you can do amazing things. And, things are fluid, people move, no situation is permanent. In any situation, take control, take a check of what you have control over and lean in there, and then give some thought to how you push the other pieces. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I would offer.
Yeah, I think for me personally, what I'm running into is I do work by myself in a center. And so there's been other coworkers and I who have said, we need more support. We're working by ourselves. We need to be able to step away or, do this or do that. And it's been like, oh yeah, I hear that, but it's been, 2 years or something. And we're still I can't do my best because I'm not getting any ability to just, take a second, walk away, regroup, think about how can I tackle this situation differently. And I mean, it's getting to the point where we used to have, just 2 staff meetings a year, and the last 2 got canceled. So we haven't even had a chance. I mean, I don't even take a lunch break, so I barely ever see any of my coworkers. The director walks through my room and I'm trying to, chase her down, hold on. And it's, that kind of thing. So it's not just short staffed. It's if one person's out, that room's closed. Yeah. Or if 2 people are out, the whole center's closed. So it's I don't know how to,
sounds like.
Yeah. And we are constantly actively hiring, and we've had people in, and I've had people in my room last an hour and then walk out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, how do we get to the point of, okay, we all agree that we need to all be on the same page and we want to talk to each other about how are you feeling? Because I know how I'm feeling. And if you're feeling that way too, I want to do what I can for you. But maybe, the management's not really feeling that way. They don't want, that kind of thing. So what would I do to kind of get everybody to be able to check in with each other to make sure we're all okay?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a really good question. And these are places where I think it can be really helpful to sort of consult with other folks who have had similar experiences. And I'm happy to take a conversation kind of offline, and be a resource. And there may be others on this call as well, who might be able to offer the same support. I think that what we do find is like I was saying, there's always a ceiling at which you just can't get your needs met. And when the ceiling is right above you, that's really hard. And sometimes, people's decision is like, this isn't the role for me because I cannot get my needs met. Like it's not okay enough. But sometimes there are things that can be done, like just different types of conversations to try to figure out like what management is thinking, what leadership is thinking about why they're not resourcing those things and exactly where kind of the barrier is. But it's really hard. I don't want to minimize it, and it sounds more complicated than we can kind of sort out in just a couple minutes.
Yeah, I was kind of hoping it would be something where it's not like you might have to look into maybe that's not going to work for you, because that's I think where it's getting to, and that's really where I don't want it to be. But I do see what you're saying is sometimes there will not be a change, and if your needs are not being met and they continue to not be met despite trying different things, then you're going to have to change your environment completely to get your needs met.
I might offer a small spin on that, which is that we all have like core values that we don't compromise on.
Yeah.
And so sometimes workplaces put you in a position, that's that moral injury piece where what's being asked feels like the compromise is too strong. So I don't know, that could be coming into play, or it could be that a different kind of conversation yields different results. Let me share this because this might help. And again, it's different if you're a team member versus a team manager, because there's limited control, right? That you have if you're like the person who's just on the team, not the person who's running the team. But I don't want to send the message like, oh, well, we're just at the other person's like whim. Is that the word? I've talked for too long. I've lost my ability to get words. Let me try that again. I'm not trying to send the message like, oh, you'll just have to take it or leave. Like, absolutely not. Because there is a place where we all shape our work cultures and we contribute just by showing up, just by modeling something different, just by offering that like, nope, this isn't good enough for me. I want to do something different here. So this is the team is secure base model. And what we do here is lean in to the parts of the work that are about interpersonal connection and vulnerability. And I saw the comment in the chat about it's not okay to not be okay, let alone be vulnerable about it. And my heart hurts for that. And I know you're telling the truth. It is true in so many workplaces. A big chunk of work I do is with lawyers, which might not feel like it's relevant. I'd be like, be quiet, Cassie. But like, think about a group that's like less in touch with their feelings and they're all trying to be okay. And they're all like have horrible rates of like heart disease and depression and addiction because they like experience all this stress that they stuff down. And I spend a lot of time in training and consultation spaces trying to convince lawyers like, you need to tell people how you feel about that and not think that that's weak or a weakness. But in order to do it, we have to change the culture. And in order to change the culture, we need people to kind of show up and take risks differently. And I know it's a big ask if you don't have positional authority, if you're not the manager, to ask you to be vulnerable about it. But we do see that this is true for almost everybody. So this is the attachment cycle put into a workplace model. So, you all do this, right? Day in, day out. If infants get these 5 things, but instead of team membership, it's family membership, they, generally build a secure sense of attachment and they believe that their needs will be met in this world. And then it's the blueprint for their relationships. But many of us got the message that at work, we're not entitled to these things or we're not entitled to talk about these things. And this diagrams comes from a group of researchers. They're in the University of East Anglia in England. I work closely with them. And they did this study on social workers who had been in the job for like a really long time. And it was like a resilience study, like what was exceptional about these workers who had done the job forever. And guess what was exceptional about those workers? Nothing, not one thing. There was something exceptional about the teams they were on. And so Avalon, I don't want to like gloss over your question or your point, right? But when we are connected to other people, when we connect with the people around us and we believe that we matter, that we are a valued member of the team, and the people around us are available. That's the first thing I heard you say. That was a challenge, right? But also when the people around us exhibit sensitivity, when the people around us are accepting, not just of who we are and our identities, but like of the fact that you mess up and sometimes you get stuff wrong, or maybe you like, forget the words in the middle of a training, whatever your little quirk is. And then when you have effective cooperation, these are the things that build healthy teams that keep people doing the work and doing the work well for long periods of time. I recently just finished a chunk of work with an early ed team. Jean, I want to just invite you. It's a no pressure situation, but did you want to share anything about the work we've been doing the last year? Is Jean still here? Uh-oh, did we lose Jean?
No, I'm
Oh.
yeah, we worked pretty much the whole year using the team-based model with our home visitors and center-based teachers. And each month we do a different topic. I think it went well. I mean, I think it was received well. I'm not saying it cured everything, because it most certainly didn't. We still have work to do, but I think it gave us another way of looking at things and another way of coping with some stuff. And I think all of our staff really appreciated having the time to do some self-reflection and teamwork.
Thank you. And yeah, it just provides a different way. Like you can even use it as a framework for resolving like problems at work, like supervisory issues. So it's something, I'm going to say this, it's something we also have a podcast about, but you could learn more about. The researchers are really accessible too. Like I did the work with Jean's team, but Jean's team is met with the researchers as well. Oh, am I sharing my presenter notes? Hee hee. We're near the end. I've gotten loopy. How about now? Okay. So I'm gonna skip this one. And I'm gonna skip this one. I want to show this again. This is that idea. We showed the slide a while ago, right? So if you're like, oh, we've been all over the place, it was too much information, come back here with me. What would a healthy workplace culture look like to you? That's one place that you could lean in and give some thought. Do you feel like you have what you need as self-care strategies? Whether you can use them or not is a structural thing. And I'm not being facetious. Like I know exactly what I need, but that includes a lot of nights where I'm not parenting or working. And you know what? Those nights don't exist. So, there are limits. Yeah, exactly. But I do have some. And when I do get time, I am able to tap into those things. And I feel like a more balanced person. What would it look like to increase psychological safety for your staff, them being able to be vulnerable in those ways? And is there something you personally can do around modeling that? What would it look like to have the roles be a little bit more mindfully organized? And what type of organizational prioritizing do you need? Because maybe the very first thing you need is permission from your center director to have some team time or something like that. What I'm going to prompt you to do here is just take a minute and consciously plan at least one thing you want to bring back with you to work, tomorrow or next week. And then I will turn off the slides and we've got just a handful of minutes for questions if you have any. And let me thank you because I know it's after hours. And so we're already intruding in your own time. Lori, were you raising your hand there for a minute?
Yeah, I had a question, and you know what? Maybe I missed it, and if I did, I apologize. With the chart, the first responder chart, the red, yellow, green, I think you had mentioned that you were going to talk about ways we could use that
Oh, did I
with
skip
our
it?
team. And if you said that, I missed it, but I would be interested to know ways, like just as like a little step, how we might use that with our team. So if
Yeah,
you
yeah,
said
yeah.
it, if you could repeat it then too.
It's quite possible I skipped over myself. So depending on the type of team you have, it can look like just introducing it, just literally printing it out and showing it to people and being like, these are words we can use. These might be things that are happening for you. Hey, by the way, if you're in the red, that's okay. You know, like talk to me about it kind of thing. If you have a team that has a high level of trust where it's okay to be vulnerable, you could start to incorporate it directly into supervisions or into team meeting check-ins. Hey, let's go around, everyone. It can either be where are you right now? Or when you're looking at it, just like I had you all do, what's something that gets you to green? Everybody share one thing that gets you to green. You know, just different ways to have people kind of interact with the color-coded chart. Depending on the workplace, you might, if it's a bigger center, a director or a manager might talk to all the various team leads about, let's talk about this, but let's first have a plan of how we respond if someone says I'm in the red. Because people can feel nervous about asking other people how they're doing when you don't know how they're going to respond.
Would
Does
you recommend, would it also be a tool that you would use one-on-one if you're doing some reflective supervision or even check-in times with staff one-on-one? Would it be appropriate to use it then?
Absolutely. And I think that it works the best, in my own experience, it works the best when it's printed out and posted in a couple of places so that people see it and it's normalized. So it's not like we're in supervision and you tell me something hard and I'm like, "Ooh, okay, hang on, Lori. I have this thing I want to show you, you know, that could you plot yourself on this, right? That can feel kind of forced and awkward. But we can say when you hang it up, hey, I have this thing up and I'm really working on this myself. And if as we're talking, I might ask you sometimes where you see yourself on it. And then if you've laid that groundwork and that comes up in a one-on-one, in a supervision, you've already kind of like built the pathway to raise it. Like most new skills, probably I'm not going to tell you all anything new here. It can feel awkward the first time you do it, but then it becomes the norm. This is the culture you're trying to build where people get asked if they're in the red and that it's okay if they're in the red. And then you help them problem solve when they are.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful.
The other thing I'll just say about this is sometimes managers or directors are like, you know, I said the idea they can't ask because they're worried everyone's in the red, but also I can't ask because like I'm liable then. And it's the same thing. If your staff are in the red and they're taking care of small little vulnerable people, like you want to know that, not from a liability perspective, but to keep them safe, to keep the kiddos safe. And so you're not like, if somebody here on this call tells me you're in the red, I don't feel personally responsible to fix you. I feel like I want to hold space for you to be curious about what you might need, right? And like that's the spirit. You want to bring that in. You're not responsible for everybody else, but we can help each other. Hopefully that helps. Darla, do we need to call it at time?
If
Thank
there
you,
are more
Cassie.
questions from people, I'm happy to have them ask them. I mean, I can stay on for a bit longer. I want to be mindful of your time as well, and I want to respect everyone here. But if there are questions, I would love people to ask them.
Is it okay if we set a norm then that if you don't have questions, you can kind of pop off, and if you want to hang out for a minute and hear more questions, stay here. We'll hang.
Yeah.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah. I just wanted to
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted
Go
to
ahead.
say thank you. And
Oh.
one of my big takeaways is just engagement, you know, kind of personal engagement, interior work about where and how and what it looks like. And then that external engagement within the context of groups and organizations of the where and the when and the how. And I just thank you for kind of plotting that out. And I agree with Tessa that it's like you've plotted something out, and I'm gonna chew and digest,
Awesome.
and maybe get back to you in a couple of weeks with a question or two.
Perfect. I'll be here, and I'm so glad. You know, it's when we like, I want us to just keep knocking down that wall of like, we're not allowed to not be okay. Nobody's okay. Nobody's okay. Let's just talk about where it's hard and see what we can fix. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cassie. And thanks everyone. Special thank you to Lori Metcalf, who suggested Cassie for this training. So thank you, Lori, and the Quality Task Force down in Bennington, which is where this conversation originated. And then I brought it to my other regional managers, and everyone was nodding their head saying, we need this. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see another offering from Cassie, from all of us in the future. We haven't talked with her about that yet, but don't be surprised. But thank you all so much for coming. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself and I can pass them on to Cassie. We will make this recording available. If there are other people in your organization or people that you know that you want to share this with, I'll let you know as soon as that goes up on the BBF YouTube channel. If you have any questions, like I said, feel free to contact me. And Cassie, you were going to pop in the chat the podcast, and there was something else you were going to pop in the chat. I can't remember.
Can I actually if I email them
Yes.
to you, can we send them out? Because I'll send a PDF of the slides too. So
Perfect.
people have the whole kit and caboodle.
Perfect. Thanks everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks for taking this 2 hours of your evening. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Cassie.
All right.
Bye,
Thanks,
all.
everybody. Great to spend time with you.
Thanks so much, Cassie, and thanks so much, Charla, and just really grateful for receiving this information again. Like it is interesting the more well, I haven't worked with it yet, but the more you bring it into yourself and you give it thought and time, it does become clearer. Like it's a lot the first time around. So yeah, I'm looking forward to what we might do as follow up. So thanks so much.
You're so
Thanks.
welcome. You're so
Good
welcome.
night, everyone.
Good night. Bye, Lori. Thanks all. Have a great evening.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye. All right.